Welcome everyone to this launch of recent ISRF independent fellow Alex Stingl's new book, Care, Power, Information. I'd like to note at the start that we at the ISRF are very aware of the current strikes at 44 UK universities and are also very concerned about conditions for academic labor. Members of our London office hope to see a positive outcome on the issues of pensions, pay, and working conditions for the striking staff. Speaking in a personal capacity, I certainly support the right of industrial action and also note the apparently frequent necessity of it in order to come to fair resolutions of conflicts that tend to be decided unilaterally by management in today's academy. Dr. Stingl is coming to us today from the National University of Ireland in Galway, and our distinguished respondent, Professor Lewis Gordon, is based in Connecticut in the United States. We do not encourage the crossing of the digital picket line, and we'll make sure that the recording of this book launch is available for UK-based academics to view in a better future time, one whose existence no doubt depends on actions like those we're seeing in the UK this week. A better future time is the prospect of what Dr. Stingl in his book calls blue scholarship, at odds with the white-collar system of knowledge production that we've inherited in today's somewhat deteriorated form. The book helps specify that deterioration. A prime mover is white-collar managerialism that steadily withdraws essential resources from the majority of workers, knowledge workers in the academic case, and reinforces the Matthew effect in research, in which the rich get richer through what Dr. Stingl at one point calls Matthew showers, that are directed selectively at the few. The result is what he terms the precarization of everything. It is precarization as the common experience that blue scholarship is designed to reverse. Blue scholarship is not a school of thought, method, theory, or political ideology, he writes, but a writerly gesture. And this is reflected in the form of the book, which is an amiably conversational weaving together of philosophers, social theorists, concepts, personal experiences, events, critiques, and intimations of the various ways in which our conditions could be much, much better than they actually are. The writerly gestures are tremendously social, and we might normally say that they form a network or a thought collective. But what I think Dr. Stingl is forming here is what he calls infrastructure. Infrastructure is the material condition of intellectual as well as social collaboration and of life in common. It means deep support structures for educational development, health and aging care, housing and transport, intellectual circulation, all of which are preconditions for really overcoming the problems we face rather than just taking some whacks at them. Dr. Stingl's infrastructure is particularly not managerial. And there's also an existential basis for it, the personal condition in which we are, each of us, in his words, no longer excusing the lack of actively participating in practices of resistance, delinking, and liberation. That is, when we stop saying that our resistance happened inside our mind, and we stop telling, quoting again, stories of our internal courage, of not having alternatives and having been forced to play along. At the risk of embarrassing Dr. Stingl before he begins, I point out that his analyses of neo-colonial, neoliberal, and not decolonized academia, and his descriptions of alternatives were written from the position of his own academic precarity, of term appointments and temporary jobs from which he could be dismissed at will. So the book is a good example of blue scholarship as a sequence of acts of courage that insist that the acts always be external and made visible to everyone for the sake of building our common infrastructure. Our event today is the third of the ISRF's second season of book launches. The first in this season was of Ilan Ruel Wall's new book, Law and Disorder, which is about the affects behind the entrance of people into their full political life through protest and other collective actions. The second was of Mike Macon-Waite's On Burnley Road, which recounts his decades of anti-racist projects in local government in trying to rebuild multi-racial community life in the wake of the rise of the British National Party. These books overlap nicely with Dr. Stingl's, as we'll be seeing tonight, Papers from the first series of launches last year appear in the most recent issue of our bulletin on post-individualism. Our fellows cover the intellectual waterfront, and yet one common theme has been the need to critique and replace toxic individuality as it has played out in the global North's relations to the rest of the world and to its own disfavored populations. We will continue this season on the third Thursday of each month at the same time, 5 p.m. Greenwich, through June. And in March, we'll launch Jonathan Saha's new book, Colonial Animals. Okay, so as Lars mentioned, we'll start with Dr. Stingl's overview of his book, which will run 10 or 15 minutes or so, and then we'll proceed with our commentator, Professor Lewis Gordon. Dr. Stingl may want to reply, and then we'll open it up for questions, which we strongly encourage you to put forward. We'll run as long as we can up till the half-hour point. And I'm going to now introduce our speakers one at a time. First, Alex Stingl, who has recently started a job as senior lecturer in sociology at the National University of Ireland, Galway, as I mentioned. Congratulations, Alex, where he is developing a new MA program in sustainability and society. He is senior fellow for climate and energy with the Global Research Network and a visiting faculty member with the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking. He took a PhD in sociology in 2008 after studying social sciences, philosophy, US American studies, and economics in Erlangen and Nuremberg, Germany. He is, among other things, an empirical philosopher and sociologist of cognitive cultures and organizations, studying extended, embodied, and enacted cognitive cultures and the modes of belonging, participation, and provisioning that they produce. His research also covers 5 empirical arenas: bioeconomy and justice, biodigitalization, biomedicalization and digitalization of childhood, digital healthcare, capital and social inequality, and finally, neurosociology and neurohumanities of gastronomic and sexual appetites. He is also the author of The Digital Coloniality of Power, Epistemic Disobedience in the Social Sciences, and the Legitimacy of the Digital Age, which appeared in 2016. Alex, let me turn it over to you. It's really a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much for an amazing introduction. And yes, I have very recently been joining National University of Ireland Galway in a permanent position after, if you count it since my PhD, 13 years. Which is not putting me on the spot, Chris, but it is something that I would have mentioned because it is something that is important for understanding where this book comes from, because I have just received this position way after I wrote the book. The book was published way after we even agreed to have this book launch. And it was written in a critical time in my life where for the past couple of years, I wasn't even sure for how long I still could sustain the life of a researcher, the life of a scholar and academic, realistically. Now that I have some sort of job security, whatever that means in our day and age, it is very important for me, and that also means asking a question of my community, that I remain accountable and that my community holds me accountable in terms of not, basically turning cold, of still keeping in mind that there are so many people out there who are not having a secure position and who continue fighting in precarious positions for not just the knowledge they believe in, but just their sheer survival. So that is something that is really important for me, and that is important for understanding where the book comes from. But it is also important to not see this as a book where the anger is directed at people out of a kind of a job envy or something. That would be misunderstanding what the book is about and misunderstanding one of its key messages, which is we should not allow to have ourselves be pitted against one another. And that is something that I may be speaking about in this introduction to the book as well. But maybe to say a word on where the book actually came from, and that has a lot to do with the previous book, Digital Coloniality of Power, where I was interested first and foremost in the following idea, or in the following conclusion I drew from a lot of little studies and inquiries I conducted, about digital culture and digitalization, beyond even this disillusionment that an increasing number of formerly digital optimists had, namely that digitalization will automatically lead to more prosperity and more democracy and so on and so on. I was noticing also, in addition to that, that very crucially, digitalization and digital culture more often than not did reinforce and make worse pre-existing social inequality and social injustices. And I wanted to find out what that really meant from a social theorist's point of view, using lessons I had learned from reading decolonial scholars, such as Walter Mignolo, such as Martina Tostanova, such as Maria Lugones and Manuela Boatka, and many, many others. Or Julian Go. So I wanted to bring this knowledge into the various theory backgrounds I had. And a number of topics came up for me where I started thinking around what does attention and relevance mean today? What is this long-running historic undercurrent? What is the relation that social science, sociology as academic disciplines in the university have to these developments in a positive and negative sense, but also as points of resistance? Here, with regard to resistance, I was very much inspired, not so much by Marxist scholars, than I was more by scholars like Ruha Benjamin, who's thinking about technology and resistance, technology and racism in very, very creative and productive ways. So being inspired by that, I started to see these long-running trajectories in society that intersect with digitalization to reinforce the coloniality of power. Hence, you could say digital culture, the inequalities and injustices it produces are nothing new under the sun. They're really just intensifications of the same old, so to speak. And at the same time, as sociology has been diagnosing that, and sociology is, while a very productive and critical enterprise, it is also in its genesis and in its creation a beast of empire, if you will. It is an imperial beast that is created by modernity and modernization with a capital M and all its imperial discontents that it's produced. It's global northern western kinds of violences. It is part of that, and you have to, even if you consider yourself, as I do, a sociologist at heart, you have to acknowledge that. You cannot run away from it and ignore it, as some people do. Accepting it and taking responsibility for it is what is called for, and that is what I've been trying to do with this new book, Care, Power, Information. The book was in many ways, of course, also a struggle with myself, my positionality as clearly a white male person from the global north, from Germany, who enjoys a lot of privileges. And even though I come from a very worker class background, to the point that I have at certain times been at least verbally assaulted in academia by people who thought themselves my betters on the basis of the class they come from and are part of, to the point of somebody once telling me in the face, oh, Alex, you reek, you really stink of labor class, right? So despite these experiences, I still enjoy a lot of privileges, and privilege here does not mean that I have kind of advantages. What privilege means, I have the privilege, in a sense, not to see certain kinds of things, not to see certain injustices, because I've never experienced them. They're not part of my world of experiences. So I'm somewhat blind to them until someone really points them out to me. What a lot of scholars do, I've realized, is just ignore that and say like, oh no, that can't be true. This is the kind of gaslighting and bullshitting we see happen very often. And I saw this happen in academia a lot, towards women, towards scholars of color. So I felt like, yes, I am privileged and I need to overcome this privilege, but I also think that sociology as a discipline has something to learn about overcoming its own privilege. Understanding, for example, what it means to be a discipline, understanding what it means to have a canon and to have these supposedly genius, great classic thinkers. What does it mean to decolonize that? And that started for me with the idea of, well, first you have to provincialize. You cannot just take these scholarships, these ideas from non-Western, from global Southern backgrounds, contexts, discourses, and then appropriate them to the Western discourse, or act like some people have done, like, oh, Western philosophy, for example, moral philosophy has always had this universal knowledge, and we just need to retranslate a little bit, we just need to retranslate Enrique Dussel into the language of Habermas, and then we can show, oh, Habermas had the universal idea anyway, blah, blah, blah. I mean, these kinds of things we can easily prove in longer analysis, and Enrique Dussel has done so in a really wonderful book on the philosophy, on the ethics of liberation, and so we don't need to do this here now, but we need to recognize that provincialization means to understand the limits by understanding the times and places and social situations and cultural contexts your theory and your methods come from, and also recognizing the good and the bad work they have done through their existence. So sociological categories, they are not universal. They can help us generally understand things, but they're not universally the same everywhere. But by treating them historically for the past 100 years as if things like modernity, things like capitalism, etc., are the same everywhere, universally the same everywhere. We have done a lot as sociologists, we've done a lot of violence to other societies, to other communities, by simply assuming that. And we can do better. And that doesn't mean that these concepts are suddenly worthless. It just means taking responsibility, owning up to what we've done good and owning up to what we've done bad. And that meant for me a lot of self-search also about my person, my growing up, the interactions I had over my life, and putting them into this work and understanding what kind of a scholar I am and what kind of a scholar I want to be, together with others, because that was another insight I thought about academia today, is that a precarization of our positions as scholars works so well because we are so trained into thinking as individuals, as individual silos with closed off borders, that for example, theory, sociological theory is a monologue that we produce in our little offices with doors closed. This is how many people against lip service often operate, right? Just think about how you produce a dissertation work when you're a scholar. It is, yes, an interaction with your supervisor and occasionally in little writing groups, but have you ever seen a dissertation that really is a true community conversation? There are some around, but they're very few. But the question is, what would happen if we thought about this as the standard? So these are the ideas that led to my book, and I identified a couple of things around the precarization of everything, and precarization means for me, above all, that you do not allow people, but also organisms, also our ecosystem, you do not allow them enough to secure their own reproduction, but you leave them just enough not to die off yet. So in this tension, this is the current climate we exist in. And when I say climate, you can see that this is also referring to climate change. So what climate change itself leads to, and the way we are like not really working towards changing it back to something better, that is precisely precarization. We're just keeping and moving towards keeping a spot position where, yes, we don't die off yet, but it's also not enough to bring anything new forward, to create a more just world, to come together in a more equal world, etc., etc. So this is where precarization of everything leads to. This is the process it's undergoing. And if you trace it back in time, I thought there is, conceptually speaking, the way that the global North, that the West has thought of things like property, for example, in colonialism, and from there into legal thought, as it is still practiced today in international law and transnational law in many countries, individually as well. That leads back to the Greek idea, the ancient Greek idea of the oikos, which described the household, which described that household's property to which also people as ownable belonged. And it describes the family structure of ancient Greece. And since people have mistakenly said, and Lewis Gordon identifies this very critically, that it is not so. Oh, you know, the ancient Greece is the abode and the origin of intellectual thought, blah 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 blah. People, it can clearly be seen how the Western philosophy of history reconstructs itself, and also legal philosophy and legal practice constructs itself out of this kind of source code of the oikos, but that it is not really the real origin. Someone like Lewis Gordon has clearly shown that, of course, the history of thought, the history of thinking goes back much, much further in history, and the Greeks only replicated ideas they encountered in other places, in other cultures, in other languages. But it is important to identify, if you want to provincialize, where this European, this Euro-modern idea of property comes from, where it is rooted in, and why it is so extremely violent, why it leads to slavery and colonialism. And part of it is because it introduces the idea of, and this is something I analyze in the book quite well, the idea of disposability, that not only nature, not only animals, but human beings can be rendered disposable. In the coloniality of being, authors like Enrique Tesel, Nelson Maldonado Torres, Maria Lugones identify this as rendering them as killable, rapeable, destroyable. And this is what a colonial thinking does. It is not just, when people say, oh, isn't colonialism just about, you know, nation states and so on and so on? No, there's also a coloniality of thinking that has colonized our minds, our ways of experiencing the world, seeing the world, ascribing values. And sociology as a discipline has adapted to that, of course, as academic disciplines do. And I wanted to analyze this. I have analyzed this, and I've tried to describe alternatives in a way that they present an invitation. I talk a lot in my work about infrastructure, by which I mean, above all, that the infrastructure of almost anything is really knowledge labor and cultural labor. This is the key for me. And blue scholarship, which comes from a place where we associate it with, yes, the actual labor, actual work of the blue collar, but also with the blues, which is something I have learned from the writings of Lewis Gordon, who I'm so grateful as the discussant for this. He's one of my intellectual heroes, really, and I admire him so much and his work. Taking the blues into account, and how there is something in the blues that we can all share, even if the blues does not originate amongst white people, but there is something something that we can still work, something that we can still connect with one another over the blues, over a melancholia, over a suffering in it, because people also in the global north, even white men, you know, can suffer in this world, do suffer in this world, and through points of connection, and then thinking together with one another, but owning up to our mistakes as well, and creating a different kind of climate. We can also shape a different kind of scholarship, and I want to call this blue scholarship, but not as a prescription of specific steps, but as an invitation. So you can even say the name is stupid, so then the name is stupid. Let's just do something. It's about doing something together. It's not about which name we choose for it. So this is, I think, a good point where we can bring the discussant in, where we should bring the discussant in, because that is how it becomes the start of us thinking together with one another. And I know nobody who's done that better than Lewis, who is a very, very generous and amazing person. So thank you for listening to me, and thank you for being here today and for paying attention to Lewis. And yeah, thank you.
Alex, thank you very much. That was great. Let's turn now to our commentator, Professor Lewis R. Gordon. He is an Afro-Jewish philosopher, political thinker, educator, and musician who holds a PhD in philosophy from Yale University. He conducts research in Africana philosophy, philosophy of existence, phenomenology, social and political philosophy, philosophy of culture, aesthetics, philosophy of education, and the philosophy of science. Though he has written on problems of method and disciplinary formation in the human sciences, Professor Gordon has more recently devoted attention to problems in philosophy of physics, especially through a series of ongoing discussions and research projects on cosmology and what he calls multidimensional theory. In addition to theories of social transformation, decolonization, and liberation, Gordon's research in social and political philosophy, also addresses problems of normative political concerns beyond justice, is the author of 10 books by my count, whose titles include Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization, What Fanon Said, Existentia Africana, Understanding Africana Existential Thought, Her Majesty's Other Children, and just out this year, Fear of Black Consciousness, which is in fact available in the United Kingdom with this very nice title, or cover, I should say. Professor Gordon, it's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. And to begin with, to everybody out there in these difficult times, I also want to say to all of you that my condolences for your losses, and also my elation for those of you who continue through finding dignity and respect to affirm life. I'd also like to say thank you to Alex Stingl, for writing this wonderful book. I say it's a wonderful book, not simply out of the question of what I agree with in the book, but also for me, a wonderful book is a book from which I can learn. There are some people who read books simply to get affirmation of themselves, instead of to have challenges to be engaged, to think, rethink, and also, as he points out with writing, the pleasure of simply being in a world of sociality, relation, communication, and the joy of what it is to learn together. Now, this book also beautifully exemplifies another institution I would like to thank, which is the Independent Social Research Foundation. This book really exemplifies a lot of its values, but it also exemplifies something that I've been thinking about for going on 3 decades. And that is the importance of making sure that we don't, as intellectuals, have ourselves cornered in a situation where we're simply fodder for those who would like to commodify or degrade thought simply into the instrumental notion of rationality. In other words, independent research foundations, and there are many kinds, as we know. There are right-wing think tanks, there are left-wing versions of these, and there are many out there, but there are also those who, through creating these alternatives, enable people to raise ideas, questions that need to be raised. And the fact that a book like this could come out connected to this foundation is a sign that you are doing something right. Now, I begin by saying this book could also be called A Critique of White-Collar Sociology, which would have been a really cool, catchy title. But the more sociology is placed in this book within a broader context of social science, and that too in a broader one of disciplinary formation and the sociology of the academy, including its contemporary neoliberal political economy of growth. You have to see the scarecrow quotes, growth, that reduces the term instead of addressing its broader understanding, right, of, say, citizenship and life development. And I'm not against the idea of looking at Greek etymologies. My argument is just that the Greek language also has etymological roots in other languages. But for our purposes, because we've adopted a lot of the terms from Greek, it makes sense to use the Greek. One could use meruneter as an example, for instance. And it's interesting when we think about oikos and we think about some of the other terms that could emerge. For instance, one of the ancient meruneter term, and we don't realize some of these terms survive, for family was crew. And to this today, we could say, yo, I got my crew. I bring along my crew. Crew is another way of saying family. So there are words that have survived in languages that go back several thousand years, maybe even 20, 30,000. But for our purposes, this argument connects to politia and arete. And politia, you could see the obvious connections to politics, to polis, and arete. It's often translated as virtue, but I don't like that translation because it's a lot more complex. The virtue tends to be Christologically mediated and connected to concepts of purity, whereas arete is connected to notions of excellence, etc. But nevertheless, Stingl speaks of the more, of the more education, again, more scare quotes, mantra. But we should stress that it refers to formal education. When people are saying more education, they're not really talking about education. They're talking about formal education, for which the prize is, more scare quotes, certification. Now, I've often lamented that we're in times of certification instead of education. And in fact, there are many people who are teaching universities who are frustrated by this because they're often tuned out because the students just want to know what they could do to get their grade, what they could do to get certified, etc. And in the midst of this, even though it's possible that we could achieve both, we could have certification education, but we're clearly living in times where certification is subverting education. If, however, there must be one, it's pretty clear that education has enabled humanity's flourishing, not certification. And we know this because certification affords, sadly, greater opportunities for hustlers and worse, prize fools, as increased governance from the right attests. And Trump's name is in the book, but we already know this. That's a well-certified fool. And properly speaking, also idiot. And in the classical sense of idiot, as a person who valorizes the privatization at the expense of a genuine public sphere, of a genuine public life. Now, with regard to the economy, Stingl rightfully points out that if it's jobs one wants, and there are people who say, go to college to get a good job, right? Or go to university. The truth, the open secret that's often being elided is that what gets you a good job is a healthy economy, okay? A healthy economy could do that much better than certifications. The open secret is the ongoing production of scarcity that affords employment for fewer in a downward spiraling of wages. I would add to this that global privatization versus global public access is part of this problem. But the point holds where we're not even economics, but if we really think about it, it's actually business. It's not even really properly economics. And this is why the etymology that Alex points to, oikos, right, is crucial, because even economics is under threat because the concept of business is something different. Business has become a kind of first philosophy. And if you're in doubt, all you have to do is look at the very movement of centers of what we call the university. Now, I've already argued that your conceptions of learning communities and advanced notions of knowledge that precede universities. But if we think from the period from Bologna all the way to the present, the university, so to speak, had as its center the seminary. And part of the process of what we call secularization was to push the seminary to the periphery and put at the center the arts and sciences. But anyone who looks carefully at universities these days will notice that the arts and sciences are being pushed to the side because something new has popped up. And what has popped up as a new cemetery, right? Not cemetery, maybe that's a little slip, Freudian slip, because there is death in there. But if the seminary, right, is the business schools. The business schools are becoming the center. And within these business schools, their correlate is the mega corporations that function as cathedrals. So we already see at work a form of structural shift that is creating a kind of center that's putting business even over economics, even over the very way we deal with the social fabrics of life. Now, white collar sociology, he points out, is Schmittian, and I would add, if you scratch Schmitt enough, it really points to Hobbes, right? The philosophical anthropology of Schmittianism is basically Hobbes's Leviathan. Now, white-collar academia is Schmittian because it aligns politics. And remember, I brought up politia, linked it with arete. And a lot of people miss this point, but we already see it in some of the debates where politics is spoken about as a kind of dirty word, okay? So it aligns politics through the structure of friends versus foes, okay, or enemies. Additionally, the important discussion in this book of Schmidt's political theology and debates on secularization between, among others, his brand and Blumenberg. And I'm so happy that Alex brings up Blumenberg's work, because you see, the inclusion of Blumenberg is important for a variety of reasons, because of the way he talks about creativity and the way he talks about legitimacy and the existential dimensions, the way in which he talks about modernity. But I should like to add that the content of Blumenberg's argument leads to a conclusion about creativity and possibility that makes modern not reductively European or white. And this is part of the problem. There's a tendency in the analysis to create a kind of stratification of concepts by which things that function as aspects of the contemporary world, the times in which we live, are treated as genealogically and originarily in their origination European. Now, I recommend addressing the closure posed by the reductivism that includes reality through using the term Euro-modern. And this is not about my work, but I would say that I would point out that the concept of modern actually precedes Euro-modernity, but part of Euro-modernity is that it's a peculiar kind of modern, okay? And so when we look through this, we can begin to go through certain aspects of this epistemically closed notion of the modern and the problems it causes. Now, again, for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to highlight some things that I really dig about the book. I love, for instance, how, excuse me, Alex, one of the reasons I'm cough, I have to drink a lot from long COVID. I love the term bureaucracy, which is a form of acrasia. And acrasia often translated as weakness of will, though I don't think that's as much of an accurate translation, but it's close. And this is a point where you're doing something wrong, but at the same time, what accompanies this weakness of will is the plethora, is the set of rationalizations that function as excuses for this weakness. So this is linked, and in my own work, I link it to what I call the market commodification of knowledge. And the market commodification of knowledge is a way of disempowering the freedom of thinking, the creativity of thought, by ultimately reducing it to the simple question of jobs instead of the calling to the life of the mind or the intellectual profession or the life of learning or pedagogy, etc. Okay? And this effort leads to some of the arguments that he discusses beautifully in his wonderful critical analysis of refeudalization from Habermas through to Neckel and others. Now, in the book, Stingl beautifully gets to the question of democracy. I'm using a lot of these positive adjectives for a variety of reasons, because I could talk about how good the book is, but I'm talking about it this way because I already plan to be teaching it and setting up discussions of it in different forums. So this is why, you know, and people who know me very well know that I don't do FUPA approbation. Anyway, the discussion of democracy that he offers gets to an interesting question about how folks look at ideals, regulative ideals, etc. And on this score, I highly recommend looking at Drusilla Cornell's book on defending ideals, because she points out a distinction between reasonability and notions of a form of absolutism or a deontological notion of ideals. And this is crucial because Alex, I could say Alex because, you know, I know him very well, but some could call him Professor Stingl, et cetera. But Alex, his analysis of republicanism as a necessary condition for democracy brings this home. And this is because of the equality on the law that's required for democracy connects with the travesty of the times. Because as we see, one of the messages of Trumpism is ultimately an attack both on democracy and republicanism, because Trumpism is to create a category of people who are above law. And this is something that's connected also to racism, because in my work, I make a distinction between privilege and license and argue that a notion such as white supremacy depends more on a license because it means a form of impunity to act out as an exception to the rules of what a democratic society requires. So this flout thing of anti-republicanism being above the law in the face of the deeds against democracy, that's a double threat. And this is one of the reasons why his analysis of how to talk about democracy is so important. And you may notice, for instance, if you look at the US, the Republican Party in the US have outright claimed that the US is supposedly a republic, not a democracy, but they're full of it. And they're full of it because we know this is a lie, since what they're doing is basically neither a republic nor a democracy, precisely because under their leadership, they would structure themselves above law. Now, the discussion of large corporate actors in the book point out that what is happening is a form of sociological organization of power that is both anti-government and anti-markets in the plural. And I hinted at this earlier. One of the things about business that's different than if we talk about economics is that the ethos in this view of business is actually to seek monopolies and monocultures. In other words, the problem, and this has started all the way in early periods of Euro-modernity with markets in the plural, is frankly, they're too human. They're too social. They're too much connected to livability. Markets have been around for more than 100,000 years. And in the pluralistic sense of markets, that's where human beings go to meet other human beings and creatively find a way. They may leave with goods, they may even leave with a little more or sell, but it's not the fundamental purpose of that public gathering that was called markets. However, if we subordinate it to profit over people, subordinate it into the kind of algorithmic structure of certain outcomes that ultimately dehumanize people, we could see the logic of what is at work in monocultural production from business. So this then leads to the overall triad in the book, because democracy, as he points out, requires negotiating relations of power, information, and care. And one of the things he does that's connected to his earlier work is that states, and this is something that someone like Frantz Fanon noticed earlier too, but it's beautiful to see it worked out in this kind of analysis, that states no longer need to be spatial and they no longer need to be nations. And this is part, and once we can understand that, we can understand why we need to deal with, in response to global privatization, global public access. This is something that is not only about geographical movement, but it's about dealing also with what's happening as we see an effort to create a kind of multicultural digital sphere. So if we think about late liberalism, for instance, there's some great quotes there, but one of the things we know is that ultimately what's happening with late liberalism is actually a form of lip service to meritocracy, when in fact, there's actually a war, just as the anti-republicanism and anti-democracy is at a war with de facto merit. As he says on page 24, in a post-meritocratic society, the meritocratic ideals remain, but the realities are hollowed out. And he points out that this kind of post-meritocratic society is based on an inheritance model for capital. Now, there are additional things that could be brought up, and I won't get through all the details here, but when I talk about colonization, one of the mistakes that's often made is to talk about colonization in a very narrow and epistemic way. But what this book does is to flesh it out in a more rich way. And in some of my writings, I point out, for instance, and this book talks about this, that the forms of colonization we're dealing with has racial and ethnic origins and misrepresentations of its history. For instance, the way I just talked about market is to address that misrepresentation of history, but there are many other examples. The way we talk about political life, the way we actually talk about the history of originary accumulation, which many people, because of a translation into English, call primitive accumulation. There's also the question of the coloniality of norms. And this is a crucial element in the book because this book is addressing that issue as well. And there's also market commodification, which is exactly what's happening to the academy. The idea of saying that it's not so much the content, the creativity, the usefulness, the flourishing, the growth in the question of citizenship and becoming better human beings. It's about simply the marketability or sellability, the commodification of the practice or the thought. So one of the issues, for instance, when many people enter graduate school these days, is they start thinking right away about their marketability. And it may be shocking for some people to know that my advisor never had a conversation with me on the market. We talked about ideas. In fact, one of my favorite memories of Maurice Nathanson is when he looked at me and he said in his Yiddish accent, "Lewis, there's no substitute for excellent work." There's also the problem of disciplinary decadence, and Alex gets into it in different ways, but I won't get into the details of that here because we should get to the committee who would like to speak. But there's also this element of solipsism. And solipsism is to give us the sense that there's nowhere to go, there's no way out. And that is what leads to some of the problems, particularly the bureaucracy that Alex talks about. Now, he talks also about the distinction of caring about and caring for. And it's a wonderful distinction linked to his analysis of pathos. And pathos is a complicated notion because in English, the connotations are different, like when we say someone's pathetic. But pathos, like in sympathos, to suffer with another, to undergo experience with another, and empathos, to take the other's experience in. This is connected to moving out of the Hobbesian model of being atomistic creatures where the other could be the enemy in which you're in conflict, into the communicative practice of empathos. You enter the human or the social world of communication. And this reminds me also of a distinction between narcissistic and self-interest love, in other words, me versus the others, so I could only deal with friend as a mirror of myself, and the other radical forms where the other is a point of reference that could even become anonymous. Now, there are all kinds of questions the book raises. It raises, for instance, the question of political responsibility. And this is crucial because, as we know, when Karl Jaspers in Schulfrage, I don't like the translation in English as the question of German guilt, but when he takes on people like Schmidt, who tries to talk about their exile in the mind, Jaspers didn't do that. Jaspers was a courageous individual who actually took on a lot of these issues in a way that's similar to what Alex is talking about in a totalitarian university environment. But we could add here, all the way from Jaspers to Arendt to Iris Young, and in my own work, I talk a lot about political responsibility, that it has a critique of moralism because moralism individualizes issues in such a way that centralizes them in the Hobbesian framework. Now, the blues scholarship, I don't think there's anything to be embarrassed about it, Alex. First of all, I love its ambiguity. I love its play on words, because it also sounds in its language like blue collar, but it's also blues. To say it, one has to say the blues, like in blues music, blues poetry. And one of the things we know about the blues is that the blues is fundamentally humanistic and mature. It deals with taking responsibility for the complexity of life. But there's also another element in this blue scholarship, because if you think about blue collar, you know, we could think about a plumber. I had a plumber whom I adored because when the plumber would come, his goal was not simply to fix what was wrong, but to guide and teach me what to do when things break down. In other words, he came here and realized that although I'm a professor, I'm also a student. And in that process, I loved learning about plumbing with him. And this is crucial for professors to understand, because to do real research is to be a student. What we are in our research is learning from it and each other. And this element, this ethos of learning communities is part of what Alex is arguing for. And this requires going through a critique of a form of theodicy imposed upon us, not only in terms of the question of privilege, which I won't develop here, but also in terms of a dialectical critique of a situation that makes us into problems instead of addressing the problems we face. Du Bois called this potentiated double consciousness. And what potentiated double consciousness is realizing the organization of institutions of power in a society that constructs people as problems in such a way that it creates a theodicy that goes away from the infrastructural causes of those problematizations. So in order to address them, there's a dialectical opposition that moves away the presupposition of the solipsism of universality into the universalizing, you notice not completed universal, communicative practices of addressing the issues at hand. So I'll close by quoting the author, quoting Alex Stingl, because this wonderful quote, which I tweeted, is basically this, and it summarizes not only the plumber and the blues artist and the professor, but it also brings up blues scholarship wonderfully. He writes, well, give a person a fish and he'll eat today. Train a person to fish and they will soon empty the sea of fish, and with no other skills will go hungry again. Educate a diverse community of people with diverse skills and an understanding of the consequences of their actions, and they will build a sustainable society, unquote. And of course, the question is, if they're willing to do so. But at this point, our task is to put that important question on the table. Thank you.
Louis, thank you. That was fabulous. I mean, it's really unusual to get that depth of engagement in this kind of an event. So I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for doing that. And also on behalf of Alex. Alex, do you want to respond, or we have one question in chat that is quite important about sort of non-university academia, but you're also welcome to, if you wanted to address something that Louis has just said.
So I won't talk much, just because I'm sure we have questions and they need to be asked. But first of all, thank you so much for this. I had not expected such an, as Chris said, in-depth engagement with my crazy little book. I mean, not little, but crazy. It is. And I'm so thankful and for all your wonderful words. And there's one thing that struck me as you were talking, with such a wonderful illustration of how people can test themselves. You have this wonderful painting behind you of people sitting around a table, sharing a meal, I think. And there is what I think is a child that is reaching for something on the table. And there is a person who is now, and this is the interesting question, what is the person in the yellow shirt doing? And a lot of people, I think, and it's not bad if you think that way, but a lot of people would maybe think, oh, they're trying to make sure the kid is held back and not, overreaching in a sense, when it's not their turn. But you can read this differently too, that the person is making sure that as the kid is reaching for food, they're not hurting themselves in any way. And I think you can have various reactions to that. These are just two, but I think those might be the two most common ones. And I think if you're looking at situations, be aware of the various ones you can see in the situation and look at the one that you would like to see as part of the community. And that is why I think I was listening to you and I saw you as the person who is helping me as a learner, me as a writer who is still struggling it has been for many years now, struggling with his writing, that you're helping, and you're helping your students. You're that amazing person sitting at the table looking out for the others. And that's where I take inspiration from. And this is what I'm trying to hope instill in the community around me as well, from that inspiration. And this is what my response is, to say, like, this book was written from those inspirations, and I hope that it can manage to maybe become the person in the yellow shirt.
So, thanks, Alice. I should let you know that I meet in different rooms, but I purposely sat down in front of this painting because I thought it exemplified the spirit of your book. So you caught that, and I'm very happy to see. And if people are curious about who the artist was, she has paintings all over the place, but it's Sula Gordon. That's a painting by my daughter, and there are many paintings that she has in various places. But you could see, although she doesn't go through the world explicitly as a philosopher or theorist, I've always argued, that you've read my writings on aesthetics, that there are many ways to do it. This is the way she expresses those ideas beautifully, and the language is there. So this is also the fact that I learned from my daughter.
Thank you very much, both of you. We have a question from Anonymous that I'd like to put on the table. I could not agree more with you, Louis, around the certification of education. I want to know how we can disseminate knowledge and research to those groups that do not have access to the academy. There's a growing literature and examples of marginalized groups being part of the research process, but they are often blocked from the dissemination phase. Publications of books, academic conferences, seminars, etc., are not typically accessible to all groups. So how can the academy view be challenged by those who are prevented from having an academy platform? That's to both of you, in fact.
I have thoughts, but Alex, perhaps you would like to respond?
It is a question, I think, that those of us who actually are willing, as Louis says, to put our thought to that are really struggling with. And we struggle for several reasons. One reason is because we also should not put academic knowledge on a pedestal. Because saying, like, how can people access, it's an important question, but it also should not be understood as, oh, we have access to some knowledge that is better than other knowledges, in an effort to then say, maybe my everyday knowledges or my community's indigenous knowledge, etc., is worth less because we don't have that access. I think that would be a wrong approach to take, although that is an approach that many people do take. So saying we need access, we want access to this kind of academic knowledge should not happen on the basis of a devaluation of other kinds of knowledges, including your own knowledge, context, background, roots. That's the first one I say. The second one is we need academics willing to share. We all complain about publishers making our papers, in a sense, unattainable by payment walls. Nobody keeps us from sending it to people who ask for them. If somebody says, could I have your paper? You don't have access to it? Here you go, you have it. It can be simple things like that. We also can use other means, using websites, blogs, fab labs, all kinds of currently available tools. The question is, how are we holding to account the people who are gatekeeping those online tools we have for dissemination, for example, right? So we allow people to gatekeep academic knowledge that we as academics, many of us precariously living, produce. We allow them to make them unattainable when we could have a say, or we could create different kinds of forums for doing so. But this will still take work in figuring this out, and a lot of conversations. I think the universities should also remember that they're not just businesses in all the contexts we have already talked about and that Louis has mentioned, but that they're also part of their local communities. And they should give their local communities, their libraries, for example, resources to use the knowledge that is produced in the local university, and not just see themselves as a global player. Not every university has to think that they're the next Harvard, or that they should be on the road to becoming Harvard and a multinationally recognized knowledge factory. But you can be a university that's good, but that's part of your local community as well. So these are just a few short answers. And I think Louis probably has, out of his many experiences, a number of profound ones to add.
Well, we have a short time, but the short version is, when we should remember that ultimately we're people who fell in love with learning. And, you know, often when I speak with students about what a professor is, they often think we're Moses with the tablets. And I have to explain to them, you know, that my view is I fell in love with learning. I continue to learn, and I could always learn from someone. And even though a student's a beginning learner, that student may come with experiences that bring something different to the conversation. And anybody who's taught knows even if you teach the same course each semester, you always learn something new precisely because of the constellation of students in the room. Now, if we go beyond the university, if we think about learning communities, there are learning communities all over the place. A lot of times when people think about often say I speak, they presume I'm traveling around the world speaking in universities. That's a fraction of the places I go to speak, even though I speak in a lot of universities. But I'm often in communities who are just in love with learning, whether it's in the Andes Mountains or whether it's in townships in South Africa or certain community centers in Nairobi or parts of India. The list is long, whether it's indigenous communities in Australia or New Zealand. And the point is that what I've learned in those communities is human beings, there's something about us. We really love to learn. And it's amazing. You go in, you're thinking you're going to hang out with folks to learn together for an hour or two, and then suddenly you find you're there 8 hours. And they're just not going. You're barely eating. And this is something crucial. That's where education versus certification is different. And in terms of access, you're absolutely right, Alex. We can make access. There's so many ways that we could make access, but also ultimately, especially when we're able to meet more in person. But right now we have certain technological access, but it's very important to go and be with people in their humanity and work among them and learn with them. And there are things that will emerge from there. There's a lot more I could say, but I'm trying to keep it short.
Yes, thank you. Couldn't agree more. We have 3 questions on deck, so I'm going to start with the first from Su Ming Ku, and they're all quite difficult. This is for both of you. The educational philosopher Git Biespa named 3 purposes of education: qualification or certification, socialization, and subjectification, that is the formation of democratic intersubjectivity. What can we say about this middle purpose, socialization?
Well, I guess, so Alex could speak more. I'll just say very quickly. If we think about, since we brought up Greek earlier, but there are other languages that have a similar term, but I'll just use Greek because people will see the immediate connection. Think of the concept of skole. Skole is, when I often have a conversation with secondary school students about this. Skole, and they always wonder, what is this? And I say, it means leisure time. And they're shocked. What do you mean? Because they thought schools were factories and they're to be disciplined in a very negative way. But I explained the idea is that when we're released from certain forms of exigency, we have a time to devote to very uniquely human things. And when we say human things in this context, we deal with the paradox that we're born human and then we spend the rest of our life trying to become human. Now, it doesn't mean that the human is the exclusive model, because the sociality model opens us to the realization in our humanity that we could communicate with non-human signifying creatures, okay, or beings or living realities. And this importance connects to what I said earlier, because you see, what those communities, when I do travel in those more remote areas, and not just me, Boaventura de Souza does this, Nelson Maldonado Torres does this, Rita Casagato does this, Maria Lagones used to do this. We're not going there like we're missionaries from the pedestal. People could tell if you're going there because you have now suspended the exigency of your time. And these are people in some cases who are poverty-stricken, right? It's suspended the exigency of that because they want this nutrition of sociality that we call skole, of learning together. And this is something that's connected to a lot of other concepts like dignity, freedom, etc. But there's a lot more on it, but I'll stop there. And perhaps Alex would like to say something on that.
Well, I can only fully say, yes, I agree with everything you said, Louis. And I would just add maybe this here. I used to work for a large chunk of my life as a bartender, very professionally, up to 5-6 nights a week for several years. And overall, I worked in that industry for 17 years while studying, getting a PhD, and while being a postdoc. And I have talked to a lot of people, and I still love nothing better than sit at a bar with a book and have a person ask, what are you reading? And when it's a scholarly book or a science fiction novel, and they're not immediately turned off of it, as some people rightly are, I mean, interests differ, right? But they strike up a conversation, and we keep learning from each other. And it is not only people that are of the same mindset or with the same background or the same academic context, but quite the opposite. And I always feel like I in a sense, profit from the encounter more than another person, because I always feel so enriched. And I think this is in all of Lewis was saying, is it is this will and attitude you go into each conversation with, as willing to learn regardless of who you are. I think that's what I sense. And socialization for me is hopefully being able to create that spirit of this willingness to be an inspiration, to put the spirit, the way that I use the word invitation as like bringing life back into something, and inspiration used to mean bringing spirit into something, right? And at the end of the day, it's the same thing, whether you invite or you inspire. It is about a willingness to be with one another and accept what the other person brings and see it as something wonderful, positive, that's enriching the community, and you're part of that community.
Let me get these next two questions in together, because we're getting close to 15 after the hour. The first is from Chanda Upadhyay, and you could spend most of the evening talking about this big and important question. Actually, how can we balance power and knowledge, and how can both of these be used for purposes of care? I would love to hear from anyone or both of you. I mean, this is a sort of the perennial question about how knowledge without armies and without capital, in the way that you were talking about was around business. How do these weaker forces deal with stronger ones? Would be one way that I would translate that. But there are others. And then from Victoria McDonald, she says, I withdrew my PhD research from my UK university because they would not accommodate my participatory action research, collaborating with 12 very talented and experienced participant researchers in poor school settings. Benchmarking my Ghanaian research inclusive of indigenous methodologies was also not acceptable to my supervisors. I chose my participant research team over my PhD program and don't regret the decision. It's a comment, but it could go in various directions. Over to both of you.
Could we, because the time's limited, also hear maybe two more?
That's it right now.
Oh, that's it.
I have a chat.
Okay.
Oh, wait, assuming Ku has also just responded from the previous question. Thank you. Abista insists that education should be closed to society but open to the world. This fits well with the idea of skole as a kind of separate or special leisurely space for nourishing learning, for learning with and from each other, developing a will to learn. There's a lot on the table.
Well, I could say very quickly, Alex, bartending is one of the great philosophical spaces. And I know you also had to be a therapist. And the other thing, and the other thing is, what we should remember is that learning takes place in many places. And that's the thing. The mistake is for us to think that it's exclusively in what we call right now the brick and mortar university. And this is hinted at in terms of the analysis that Alex gives on states and space. But there's a lot that I could say there, but this is your moment, Alex. So I think it would be great for you to continue.
I think there is a good point you're making about the brick and mortar spaces, because the question to both of these last comments is, where does care happen? And how does care happen? It is obvious, I think, that for me, care and knowledge and cultural labor are intertwined things, intertwined practices, if not the same in a way. And I think the person who chooses her community over the certificate has chosen care over a place, over a brick and mortar place. Because care has, the place where she looked for the PhD, care had left the building, so to speak. And that is, first of all, extremely sad. And it is, and it addresses very much the problem, one of the problems I'm trying to talk about in the book. But it also asks the question, like, what precisely is power in its relation to knowledge? I think we have in this whole tradition now of Michel Foucault and talking about Michel Foucault. But the talking about Michel Foucault ignores what he was trying to do. Because he was also a person who, by the way, had a lot of faults, and there was a lot of stuff he wasn't talking about and ignoring, and such as, you know, colonialism, and we could talk a lot about this as well. But he was somebody who was trying to also explain to people that power and knowledge, and therefore care, does not have to reside in a brick and mortar building, but it is where you take it. And he would often take it to the streets at his own, you know, physical danger. Stories that he went to demonstrations where he got his ribs broken and these kinds of things. So he was an activist, and activism is also a knowledge and a care practice, and it is one that has its own power. It establishes its own power because activism understands that violence and power are connected in the one hand, but power is also many, many other things. It is how you create a will of people for change, a will maybe to battle sometimes, but also a will to make peace, a will to open doors, and a will to close them to those who are not willing to open doors for others, right? All of these, and I think, and this may sound a little bit abstract, I know, but what I'm getting at is there's a will to power, there's a will to knowledge, but there's also a will to care. And maybe we should start in these discussions with, what does it take for us to care? What does it take for us to care about others, first of all? Because if we care about others and for others and learn to care about ourselves and for ourselves in one constellation, right? Then this caring automatically involves knowledge about care, knowledge for care, caring for knowledge. So I think that the caring and caring for others again is the starting point, and caring for others again, and that brings us back to something Lewis mentioned from the book, is a lot about empathy. And empathy is not sympathy. Empathy means instead that we can bring the other, as Lewis so wonderfully said, in us, right? It means developing an understanding of the others around us and what, for example, how we would experience their story. We can never be the other person. I will never, you know, fully know from the inside of my body what it is to be a Black woman in America, in US America. I never will know this from but I can do what I can to understand, to bring this into me, to understand what these experiences can be like and how violent they can be, and I can care. It's not my job, and should not be to then be this voice from abroad to say like, oh, I'm going to be the protector, do the right thing. This is not what this is about, right? It's not my job to be the white savior or something like this. But it is my job. It's not my job to find an answer, but it's my job to have a response, right? And to take responsibility through care for what I see, and make sure that whatever I can do, knowledge about it is in the world, and that where people are being disempowered, I make that explicit. I cannot, you know, give people power. This is an imperial gesture, but I can make sure that people know where people are being disempowered. and what knowledge is around to help them find their power again and find their voice again. And by showing them, yes, there are people who care. Maybe that's the best I can do, and maybe that's not enough, but it's a beginning. It's an invitation, in my view, for community.
Thank you, Alex. That's actually a really great answer to the knowledge power question, and to, understanding knowledge as a care practice that we take outside. We are out of time. I want to thank both of you and also the audience for really wonderful insights, and also for showing the kind of the intellectual energy that you have of the continuous sort of going beyond the limitations of the structures that we've inherited and that we're still struggling within. And a final sort of a shout out to the strikers who are taking the work of care outside of their buildings and into the streets outside of universities, which is where all of us are going to continue to practice one way or the other. Thank you again, Louis, Alex, everyone in the audience. We will see you next time. Good night.
Thank you for joining us. For ISRF updates and information about future events, please sign up to our mailing list at www.isrf.org/mailing list. Goodbye.